Welcome back to these series of lectures on Western Civilization, Part 1. Today we're going to talk about the Hebrews. I call this lecture The Hebrews, Small Nation, Big Impact. The context, of course, is religious history. The significance, from ancient Hebrew religion, we see the rise of monotheism. And of course, ancient Judaism gives rise to both Christianity and contributes heavily to Islam as well. So what I want to do to begin with is just talk a little bit about geography, try to locate us physically in the Middle East. We'll just say just a very brief survey of political history of the ancient Israelites. We're going to talk about historical problems that emerge from analysis of the Bible. We're going to look at the book of Genesis in particular, try to describe it. We're going to look at origin myths. There are at least 2 and perhaps 3 origin myths in Genesis. So we're going to take a look at those, and we're going to look at the flood myths and compare the Genesis flood myth, the story you know about Noah. We're going to compare that to the Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient Sumerian story, which also has a much older flood myth, and the similarities between the two are astounding. We'll also look at the Tower of Babel, and so we're going to make our way through this material. There's a lot of it. We're going to break this lecture up into probably 3 sections. I spend a good deal of time with this because of its obvious importance. Judaism gave birth to Christianity, and of course Christianity is the face of the faith, as well as the face of Western civilization. So it's impossible to overestimate the impact that monotheism has had on Western civilization. So let's start with geography, so we try to locate ourselves. This part of the world has gone by a number of different names. Today it's the modern Middle East. Where we're looking at specifically has been called Israel. Judah has been called Palestine. Some people today still call it Palestine. The modern state of Israel is located here. So let's look at geography a bit. Just to the west, we have Egypt. The kingdom of Egypt is very old, a homogeneous population for the most part. And then to the east, we have Mesopotamia that we've already talked about with Sumer. Here we have a much more heterogeneous population. Where we're talking about today in antiquity was known as Canaan. And indeed the Hebrews referred to this as the land of Canaan. Here there's no great power, there's no Sumer, there's no Egypt. In the land of Canaan, just to the west, of course, you have the Mediterranean Sea. And then just to the east, you have modern-day Jordan, and then, of course, the Syrian desert, where many of our troubles are taking place today with ISIS. Canaan is, of course, a fairly dry place. There's no Nile. There's no Tigris and Euphrates flowing through it. Canaan's dependent upon rainfall for crops. So there is a sense of scarcity in Canaan that you might not see in ancient Sumer or ancient Egypt. In Canaan, there's no unified political authority for the most part. Little independent city-states, east and west of the Jordan River as it flows south through Canaan. Remember that these large riverine societies, Egypt and Sumer, that have these great rivers, require a powerful central government to organize large-scale agriculture, the building of irrigation canals and dams, to control these rivers, to make possible urban civilization. Canaan really doesn't have that. In Canaan, the water resources are local, the Jordan River and various springs. And like I said before, the ancient Israelites, or the Hebrews, recognized that they themselves lived in the land of Canaan. And of course, you've all heard this word growing up in Sunday school or church. Just a few brief remarks about political history here. The Hebrews are obviously heavily influenced by the ancient Canaanites who were there when the Hebrews arrived. The Hebrews are heavily influenced by the ancient Phoenicians and the Egyptians, obviously. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, you see there's a number of references, especially in Exodus and in Genesis, to Egypt. Of course, Abraham, the father of the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, was a pastoralist who was commanded by God to leave Sumer and move west to this new land of Canaan. There is among Israelite history, there is a tie of bondage, perhaps, to the Egyptians. The Egyptians tend to dominate this part of the world, and according to legend, dominate the Hebrews as well. The Hebrews may, though, have had an exalted status in Egypt. If you think of Moses, if you think of Joseph, who held very high positions in the Pharaoh's government. I think it's important to note that the Hebrew sense of unity, a sense of identity, a sense of nationalism is created by their being surrounded by these much more powerful states. Egypt, Babylonia, the Assyrians, much more powerful, well-organized military states. The Israelites being a smaller pastoral people. Their identities formed in opposition to these larger states. The Hebrew kingdoms divided, of course, in antiquity. The northern portion being called Israel, the southern portion being called being called Judea. The northern portion, Israel, was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 before the Common Era. And then Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. Then, of course, the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, or what Christians call the Old Testament, is the Jewish scripture. And it's created in round figures from approximately 2000 before the Common Era down to about 200 before the Common Era. Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, of course, plays a role here. The Jews had been scattered and sent into exile into Persia. He allows these exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple in 516. Here you have this obvious turn among the Israelites toward monotheism. Jews no longer accepted tacitly or otherwise the existence of other gods. And then finally, you move into the what we call the Hellenistic era, or the Greek era. You may remember, actually this is in front of us. We'll talk about Alexander later. Alexander will spread Greek culture, or Hellenistic culture, throughout Palestine, Canaan, the whole Middle East for that matter. The biblical period really ends during the time of Alexander. The books of the canon have already been created, and here we're talking about the Old Testament, or the Jewish scripture. Now, historians, of course, have to approach the Israelites, the Hebrews, and their scripture, what we call the Old Testament. We can't approach it as a theologian. This, after all, is not a Sunday school class. This is a history class. So I want to talk about some of the problems that historians and other scholars, archaeologists and otherwise, encounter when trying to reconstruct the history of the ancient Hebrews. First of all, there's no evidence for the Exodus. You remember in the Old Testament, you have the well-known story of the Jews escaping the clutches of the Pharaoh. and moving to the promised land. There's no archaeological evidence for this. The Egyptians dominated both the Sinai Peninsula and Canaan. Therefore, the biblical account of the Jewish Exodus is problematic. Moses did not write these stories. There was not any Hebrew writing system at this time. And of course, Moses' death could hardly have been written by himself. He refers to his own death, so it seems most unlikely that he wrote it. Remember that the Egyptians are meticulous record keepers, but there is no Egyptian evidence of any groups of Hebrews having been present in Egypt and then leaving Egypt, or anyone named Moses, for that matter, having ever existed. So for historians, this is troublesome. Again, we have to distinguish between history and faith, two quite different things. The notion that there's a large guerrilla force of Jews wandering about the Sinai for 40 years in an area patrolled by the Egyptian military is not credible. If there's no Exodus, of course, there's no conquest of Canaan. It's unlikely that the walled cities in Canaan, the Egyptian authorities would not have allowed such a thing, as it would have impeded their dominance over the area. You've all heard of the walls of Jericho, for instance. This is problematic. And of course, we all know the story of Eden. Historians look at this as perhaps this story provides a sort of conceptual underpinning of the formation and the rise of the Israelite nation and religion. So the real history could be the reverse, could be an ironic reverse of the biblical account. Perhaps the Israelites were the result rather than the cause of the collapse of the Canaanite city-states. Perhaps the Israelites moved into this area that had been devastated. We go further as historians sort of pick apart Genesis. In Genesis 1 through 3, there's sort of a splendid contradiction. Here it says sex is good, part of divine creation. We are to procreate, we are to multiply. And then, of course, it is also proclaimed that sex is bad. This is the result of disobedience. You are to cover yourself. You are to be ashamed of your nakedness. So we have these contradictions that both literary theorists and historians and other scholars have had to grapple with. So I'll end by something I've already said here, and that is that extensive archaeological research throughout this area simply does not support the Exodus or the conquest. The historian would have to think to himself, then why does this literature exist? And one plausible explanation is that this is the Hebrew attempt to fashion a history for themselves, to bind their people together, to create a sense of nationalism, a sense of unity in opposition to these larger powers surrounding them. So that's just some of the problems that we'll encounter as we go forward. I'm going to stop there for now, and we'll pick up with the origin myths in Genesis when we get back. Thank you.